Hey everyone, Ben Rad here. Welcome to the fourth part of the tutorial series. In this particular tutorial, we're going to be talking about sidechain compression. Sidechain compression is a technique that's often used by Deadmau5 and other minimal producers, I would say. Minimal techno producers, that is. It is a way of not just creating interesting modulation in your sounds, but I also use it to help with the overall mix down of your lower end instruments, such as your bass drums and your sub bass, your bass sounds. And I'll show you what I mean in a bit. So I'm going to go into a bit more depth about what sidechain compression is as well. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you my sub bass and my kick and my snare tracks, and I'm going to show you something that it's pretty much a guarantee whenever you're working with sub bass sounds or just electro music. So first of all, let's have a look at the frequencies of both the sub bass and the kick and the snares. So what we'll do is open up our equalizer, put on analyzer, and I've got the sub bass soloed here, so we'll play that. Now, as expected, lots of sub sounds here, but it's trailing off quite far into the middle of the frequencies here. And what's going to happen is that's actually going to be overlapping quite severely with the kick and even the snare for this particular track. So what I'll do is I'll solo the kick and the snare now. Let's close that, and we'll open this up. So we've got our kick and our snare, and I'll solo these and analyze them. Now you'll notice there is still sub bass there. Now I might actually end up cutting that a little bit later on down the line as well. But you'll notice there's a lot of overlap in this sort of area. Let's get the two together. So this sort of area, there's a lot of overlap, and you'll even notice that whilst I'm playing that, the sub bass is definitely taking away a lot of the punch from the kick drum. If it's not that obvious to you, what I've done is I'm just going to give you an example, or well, a better example of that. So what I've done is I've basically, instead of having the sub bass as a sort of a very rhythmic bass, I've just got it as longer notes, and you should be able to get an idea as to what I mean. So if I play this now, it's this soloing just the long sub bass sounds along with the kick and the snare. So essentially what's happening here is the sub bass is kind of overcoming the kick drum quite severely, and that's going to get lost in the mix along the way. And for electro music, it's very, very important that the kick, which is holding the rhythm, is very prominent, and it's not drowned out by any other frequencies, whether that be the bass or any other synths you might be working with. So I'm going to be using sidechain compression to help with this, and I'm going to use this this new sub bass sequence that I've got here, just to kind of demonstrate it in a bit more easily. So essentially, what we're going to be using, let's bring up our compression on this sub bass channel, and I'm going to show you what I mean. So essentially, what compression normally does, as we explained in the second tutorial, essentially, depending on the thresholds, you will be essentially taking whatever waveforms go above a particular threshold, and you'll be compressing those waveforms by a particular amount. Okay, and then what you can do is, if you're doing this on a whole sound, that's usually going to compress the overall wave down slightly, and you can use the gain to up the volume of the actual sound. Now, in this particular instance, what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be using compression on the track in the same way. So we're going to be compressing the waveform, but we're going to be doing that only when it's triggered by the kick and the snares. And how do we do that? So we know that the kick and the snares are on bus 1. So what we're going to do is we've got the sidechain section here at the top right hand corner of the compressor, and if we click on that, we can see that we've got all these options. So these are our buses here. We can also sidechain it to any audio tracks as well, but we're going to do this to the kick and the snare. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, just for effect, I'm going to throw down the attack and the release and put on pretty heavy compression, and I'm going to lower this threshold here. In fact, let's do it from the top. We're going to lower this, and we're going to see what, as we go, and see what happens. Now you'll notice that this is only cutting off now when it's being triggered by either the kick or the snare sound coming from the bus number 1. And what this is doing is essentially compressing the sub bass so that every time it's triggered, the actual sound will be compressed and duck down in the mix. And that way it'll appear like the kick drum is actually coming in a lot harder, and it's not being as muffled by the sub bass. So let's see if we can get a good idea of this. So let's play this again. Now, if that's not obvious to you just yet, then what we can do is we just mute the kick and the snare. And what we'll be doing is this should still be triggered, the sub bass, and you'll hear it ducking down every time, and you can actually see it on this meter here. So just for effect, let's bypass that. And then throw the sidechain compression on again. Okay. So essentially what's happening is every time the kick and the snare is coming in, this waveform is being compressed heavily down, and it's ducking down underneath the mix. So let's put the kick and the snare back in again. Now that's ducking down quite a lot. I don't really want it to duck down that much, so I'm probably going to raise up this threshold. So every time I raise this, it's going to be ducking down a little bit less. Now, we're not going to worry too much about the attack and the release, and I'll tell you why. The reason for this is just like normal compression, the attack and the release essentially dictate how quickly or how slowly the compression is going to come in and then be released. So for this particular instance, since the kick drum is quite a hard sound, we don't want the compression to be coming in very, very slowly. We want it to be coming in very, very fast so that the sub bass ducks down and is compressed as soon as the kick drum comes in. So for that reason, we're going to have the attack really, really low. Now, the release, again, if we want it to only be compressed when the kick drum is actually playing, we'll have the release really, really low. Now, you've got some artists like 7 Lions who are using sidechain compression really cleverly and having very, very high release times. And what that's doing is that's basically creating these kind of like these very interesting pad sounds, which essentially, well, I think if you listen to the 7 Lions, I think it's Days to Come track, you'll know what I mean. The main drop comes in, the main pad starts very low, so and that's because of sidechain compression, I believe, and using a very, very slow release. I mean, I'll try this now just for effect. It's hard to see what's happening here, to be honest, but I think I'll work with that method later on down in the series. What we're going to do for now is we're just going to have this really, really quick release and really, really quick attack, and that way it's just going to duck down when the kick and the snares come in. Okay. What we're going to do is we've been working with our example. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the compression on this new instrument. I'm going to throw this over to our actual sub bass track. I'm going to get rid of those, mute that, and you know what, I will solo that just so you can see what's going on. Now you notice because these are quite short and the compression is coming quite hard, it's actually, the sub bass is not as prominent now in terms of, it doesn't feel as fat. Now I'm still going to leave the compression going to the same threshold, but I'm going to leave it a tiny bit of gain, and that's going to do exactly as it did with the kick drum, in that it's not necessarily going to have it overcome the mix. It's just going to heighten it that slight bit, just to give it that bit more body to it. There you go. I mean, that's fine. Let's hear that in the mix. Did you notice when I bypassed it that the kick drum didn't sound as prominent? And that's because there was more mud in the lower end, caused by the sub bass and the kick drum essentially colliding and creating too much lower frequencies. I believe it sounds a lot better with the sidechain compression. So just to very quickly recap on what we've been doing essentially. We've been talking about compression, but sidechain compression. Really, really simple. We use it in the same way that we would use our compression on our standard sounds. So all we're doing is we are compressing a sound, but we are having it compressed by triggering it via another bus or audio sample. So in this case, we have our bus 1, which is our kick and the snare. That's another good reason as to why I always group my kick and my snare separate from my other drums, because normally I will have my sidechain compression on, at least on my bass sounds, triggered by the kick and the snare. So by having those in one bus, I can then sidechain compress everything into bus 1 by the kick and the snare. Every time the kick and the snare comes in, the sub bass will duck down ever so slightly because it's being compressed, and then rise back up in between those kicks and those snare sounds and fill out the sound a bit more. So hopefully that's been a good tutorial on sidechain compression. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments section and I'll try and answer as best I can. For now, my name's been Ben Rad, aka The Mysteries of, or Jack of all trades, master of none. This has been sidechain compression. I'll see you in the next tutorial where I think we are going to be working with some pad sounds. Thank you very much. See you later.